Welcome back to the DemystifySci podcast. I'm Anastasia.
I'm Shiloh.
And this is the place where we explore the theories and ideas that are going to change the world. And today, we have a real treat. We have talked a lot on this podcast about the inversion of institutional missions, where we walk through the world and we see that the institutions that we once trusted and respected have started to fall apart and fail us in a variety of ways. And nowhere is this more obvious than in the healthcare system, where as the rising costs of treatment creep ever upwards, the actual quality of the services that are delivered creep ever downwards. And nobody really can explain exactly why this is happening. But we've been in contact with two emergency physicians, Dr. Coleen Rickabaugh and Dr. Patty Robitaille, who have found that there's been a very strange feature of the healthcare industry developing over the course of the last 30 years, which is called Sham peer review. There was a law in the 1980s called the Healthcare Quality Improvement Act that created a lever that hospital systems, owned by larger and larger conglomerates, could use to punish those physicians that ever spoke out against cost-cutting measures.
These two doctors are here in the studio to walk us through what exactly happened since I was a kid to healthcare. In other words, how is it that I feel like a number when I walk into a hospital, whereas when I was a kid, I actually had a relationship with my doctor? This surrounds a strange healthcare act that had been corrupted by corporate greed over the years. And the story is really detailed and magnificent, and these two can tell the story better than anybody else.
So Patty and Coleen are on this mission to change the law that allowed all of this to happen. And the stakes for their mission are pretty high, because we're on this path that began in the 1980s, where the quality of care at hospitals began to be degraded, and profits became much more important than patient care. And the really, really creepy endpoint of this entire arc is that if the patient is simply representing some final profit that a hospital can extract from a person, then the ultimate profit that can be extracted is literally the physical contents of the body. It is the tissues and the organs of the people who walk through the door of hospitals. And it sounds horrific to say or to imply, but over the course of the last few months, there's been some really alarming reports about the fact that the organ trade is so massively powerful that hospitals are letting patients die and harvesting their organs and selling them on the wider market. And if this act isn't changed, then the physicians that work at these hospitals that want to blow the whistle, that want to say, hey, hold on a second, we can't keep doing this. What we're doing is wrong. They cannot do that because there's a way that these hospital systems can ensure that their entire livelihood is destroyed. And so in this conversation, we unpack what that law is, how it's destroyed healthcare, the potential outcomes if we don't change it, and what Patty and Coleen are trying to do in order to change it.
It's an incredible template for how we might go about repairing a number of institutions that have sagged under the weight of various corruptions over our short lifetimes. And that's good news, because I look at something like the university that I work at that's sort of being shook apart by various arms of corruption. And I think, man, this place has really good bones. These are nice buildings. This is a beautiful campus. It sure would make a lot of sense to repair and renew and rejuvenate this thing than to just burn it down and build something in its place, as appealing as that might seem on its surface. So I think this is a really cool template to follow, and I really believe that they can pull off this reform bill.
Absolutely. If you enjoy this podcast, and if you enjoy the ideas that we bring to you every single week, twice a week, then consider supporting us on patreon.com/DemystifySci. For 75 cents a week, you can ensure that this project continuously grows and becomes stronger. It allows us to host in-person events, fly people out for interviews, and write more books and make this into something that really can change the world.
If you'd like to participate one-on-one, you might sign up for Paradigm Drift. That's the segment we do once a month where you, as a theorist, get a chance to put your name in a hat and maybe be pulled out to present your idea to thousands of people. We'll talk to you for a little bit afterwards if we do pull your name. You can find out more about that on our website, DemystifySci.com. We're also working towards some sort of live streaming event, so keep an eye out on social media because we would like to open up the floor, get some Q&A from you guys directly, and have some actual real interactions.
Finally, if you want to support the podcast, there are 2 other ways in which you can do that. Number 1 is that we are selling clothes. We have printed some hoodies. One design is Shiloh's, one design is mine. And so if you tend to get cold now that winter is coming, consider picking up a hoodie. We are also very, very, very extraordinarily proud of something else that we have in our shop, which is our vinyl record. We have a band, it is called Secretary of Nature, and we have printed vinyl of our first record called Everything Is So Good Here. It is 6 songs of sorrow, of happiness, of contemplation, of psychedelic rock that allow us to explore the ideas that permeate us but do not really fit into scientific discussion. And so if you want to check it out, here's a couple of seconds of it before we get into our conversation with doctors Coleen and Patty about how they are going to save the American healthcare system from sham peer review. We'd like to believe that you go see a doctor or you go to the hospital, and the people that are inside the hospital, the ones that are administering the care, are the ones that have the lever on the quality of care. And that if there's something happening inside the hospital that they don't like, if they think that this profit incentive has become far too central, that they can do something about it. But from talking to both of you, it seems like that's not what's happening. It seems like the ability of the physicians that are working inside of these systems to actually speak up when something goes wrong, when that profit incentive becomes too central, has been functionally eroded. And so in the last 30 years, we've seen a transition from community hospitals to these large conglomerate hospitals. And at the same time, we've also seen this erosion of the ability of the doctors inside of these larger systems to be able to speak up and to say, hey, something's gone wrong. We can't be treating people like this.
I would say that's true. You know, in every system where you're dealing with a public safety phenomenon, right? If I get on an airplane, I want to know, okay, are these pilots adequately trained? Am I going to get to my destination safely, right? If I have a nuclear power plant near me in my neighborhood, I want to know that the people that go and work there have been, adequately checked out, and there's this safety measure in place. And for hospital systems, the safety measure was supposed to be this law that was enacted in 1986. It's called the Healthcare Quality Improvement Act. These things always have interesting names. It was created in 1986, and it was supposed to be this safeguard. Okay, if a bad event happens with a patient, how does the hospital system handle that? What is the safety mechanism? And this law created a system called physician peer review, and it was a process. It was a process whereby a physician could go and talk about a bad outcome or even a near miss, for example. And it was supposed to be a non-jeopardy event, right? Because everybody who participated in this evaluation enjoyed immunity. And
like you wouldn't get in trouble for bringing something up.
You could speak up without any concern of losing your job or having your medical license impacted. And then, so what they created was this National Practitioner Databank, right? So the law was in 1986, right, Patty?
Right.
But the Databank didn't essentially function, as you say, till
1990. And that's because when you have a law, you have kind of the outline of what you want to occur, but then there's regulations that come from that. And then there's the National Practitioner Databank book or guidelines, and that's 200 and some pages. And so they have to get all the nitty-gritty details of how this is going to operate.
And what was the original point of the databank?
There's 2 major ways that you can get on to the databank. And one is quality of care, and that's what the whole act was about was the furtherance of quality healthcare. So if you are sued in a malpractice case, and not everybody who gets sued goes through the malpractice case. You could be the emergency physician, recognize what happened, admit them to the hospital. But when they sue, a lot of times it's just a wide net that's cast, so you could be named, and then they sort it out, and then you get tossed out of the case. But let's say that, they decide to settle, or your insurance decides to settle. And that can be without your permission. You say, no, I didn't do anything wrong. I want to go forth. And they say, hey, this isn't worth, the cost of litigating to us as an insurance company. So we're going to settle on your behalf. So you may or may not have to be able to give permission. So if the case is settled and dollars are paid out, that goes on to the National Practitioner Databank. If you go to trial and you lose and dollars are paid out, that goes onto the National Practitioner Databank. If your hospital has quality of care issues and determines that, yes, indeed, there are quality of care issues, and we're going to suspend you or terminate you from the medical staff, that goes onto the databank. So it's quality of care is one. And then behavioral issues are the other. And, if you're having sex with your patients or the patient's mothers, or, you're in the operating room and somebody hands you the wrong instrument and you cut them with a scalpel, something like that, something egregious.
Like you would cut them for handing you the wrong instrument?
Well,
Who are these people?
Yeah. I've heard of it.
Wow. Okay.
So behavior is another thing.
And the objective was that if a physician was harming patients, then that could be reported to the databank. That way that physician couldn't just leave that hospital system and go work somewhere else after they left a trail of misery, in their wake.
So it's supposed to be a safety adaptation to this new way of doing medicine that's starting to happen around that time.
Right. So it originally had great intent, right? It was this safety net. But it also provided a way for people to come forward and, question a patient care issue and kind of work it out, right? And come to the right solution without it being a jeopardy event. But sadly, what has happened is this whole law, this safety system, has been completely inverted. And over time, because the hospitals enjoy immunity from these processes, they would basically report good physicians who were advocating for patients, they would report them to the databank in what's called sham peer review. And we came to learn that this was a huge problem and shocking, right? The other side of the equation is that if there were physicians who brought a lot of revenue into the hospital, let's say orthopedic surgeons or cardiac surgeons or neurosurgeons, and if they were repeatedly causing patient harm or they had bad outcomes, then the hospital administrators would look the other way because they were bringing a lot of revenue in.
So it appears that it's not just the administrators that don't get in trouble, but it's also the physicians that are doing bad things that don't get in trouble, as long as the bad things that they are doing are aligned with the interests of the financial bottom line.
Yep. Yes. So, as an example of a physician who should have been reported to the databank and taken offline, it's actually a famous case, and they've made movies about it. It's Dr. Christopher Duntsch. So he had trained in Tennessee, and he had a little bit of a storied past. During his residency, he actually had a cocaine problem and had gone to one of these PHP programs. And he actually had some restrictions on his practice. He trained then in neurosurgery, and normally neurosurgeons, to gain the expertise that you need, they do 1,000 to 1,200 surgeries during their residency. And this doctor only did 200.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. grossly understandard. And so he took his first job out of fellowship in a hospital in Dallas. And it was supposed to be minimally invasive surgery. And this guy was a disaster from the start. He had really bad patient outcomes. Patients were paralyzed. And the surgeons who operated with him noticed that he was thoroughly incompetent. They were shocked. I mean, he was operating on the wrong part of the patient's back, spine surgery. And minimally invasive surgery, mind you, should be, the whole point of it is there's not a whole lot of blood loss, right? You recover quickly. It's not that the old time, surgeries where you had a large incision and a longer healing time. They're supposed to be minimally invasive. And he would have these inordinate amounts of blood loss because he would cut blood vessels. He would cut ligaments that weren't supposed to be cut. He would put hardware in inappropriately. And the surgeons noticed this, and, they were complaining about it. And neurosurgeons work in a bunch of different facilities, so you run into the same neurosurgeons if you work in a certain area. And so he basically had maimed all these patients. One of them was a friend of his that he actually operated on. And then he just would move on. He'd resign, and no Databank report was created. So he moved among several other hospital systems and continued to maim patients. Paralysis. You went for a routine disc, pinched nerve, or whatever the public usually knows it as a pinched nerve or a bulging disc. These were just routine bread and butter procedures. And so it was so egregious to the point where the patient would be hemorrhaging. And normally you'd lose very little blood in a spine surgery. They would be hemorrhaging and he just wasn't even noticing it. So his colleagues had witnessed this. And it's a long story of leaving one hospital, going to another, maiming patients. And then finally, one of the surgeons who had actually had to go in and do salvage surgery to fix this one patient's problem, he went in and recorded just how bad Dr. Duntsch's surgery was, right? He made a video recording of it. And several of his patients died, did not survive his surgery. But a lot of them were maimed, right? And he had this video evidence. And so finally, there was a legal team that was assembled. I think this was Kay, right? Van Way. And they were actually able to prosecute him, strangely enough, not for the deaths, but for the maiming of one patient, because it just happened that this surgeon witnessed it and took video evidence of it. And that's how he got convicted. And then I think Kay and an assistant attorney general had teamed up, and it took them 2 solid years of working on this case. They were committed to just taking him offline. And once they had presented the jury with all the other patients who had been harmed, he went to prison. But imagine that they could have caught him early on when they were made aware that he was not a capable surgeon. He did not have to keep moving through the system and going from hospital to hospital. So there was this trail of misery that this guy created.
But nobody wanted to peer review him because it would make them look bad as a hospital?
That, and strangely enough, whenever people would report him, people were in disbelief that someone could be this bad. Even other medical professionals, there's no way this could have happened. But the people who bore witness to it were convinced, and so they assisted the team in helping get him prosecuted. But
he was never peer reviewed.
No. He escaped through the system. He would resign, and then because he resigned before any investigation was initiated, he just was able to move on.
And so are you trying to close that loophole somehow?
We want those patients data banked. We don't want
the physicians, yeah.
The physicians. We want those physicians reported to the data bank so they can stop harming patients. That was the whole purpose of the law.
And you're basically making the case that the law is, in addition to the incentives being inverted, where it's about profits versus patient care. There's also this weird inversion of the databank, which, because of the fact that it carries the stigma for the hospital that had the bad physician, that hospitals don't want to databank their bad physicians, because then if HHS starts to look, then they have to deal with the fact that maybe they have bad hiring practices, or maybe they have bad quality control, or maybe they're liable for harming all of these patients. Is that kind of the
Currently,
reason?
there's no sanction to a hospital for not reporting them.
Right.
Or
So this would
not-
be included in the administrative subsection of the databank
Yeah.
that's proposed.
So the whole objective of this law was to take out those people on the left end of the curve, right, and make sure that they didn't harm any patients going forward. But you have these physicians on the right tail of the bell curve who are actually advocating for their patients. They're doing the right thing. They're calling out safety concerns, and they end up getting sanctioned because the hospital doesn't want the bad reputation that results, from finding something, from somebody calling out a safety issue, for example. So the whole law is upside down.
Would you say that this peer review system is a nucleation of the conflict between these two entities, the physicians and the hospital system? Is this the first point where you really start to feel a tension between these two entities?
Well, the strange thing is most physicians don't even know about the law. And if they fall prey to these kind of tactics of sham peer review, where they're accused of being disruptive, that's a term that's used a lot. It's like it came out of nowhere. They didn't even know that this was possible. So
you don't take a class in med school on this.
There's no teaching on any of this. Yeah.
No. And if it happens, it's like a deer in the headlights. You have no idea what to do, and I'll just explain my thought on this and they'll understand. But they don't realize that, you're headed down a pathway through which you have no control. And, healthcare is supposed to be about the patient. As far as I'm concerned, the providers, the physicians, and administrators should all be pulling in the rope on the same direction. This is about the patient. And I can tell you for, 30 years plus, if I had students and so forth, I would say, do what's best for the patient. Always keep the patient in mind. It's your guiding principle, your North Star. And if you do that, you will never go wrong. But
that's what's so interesting and universal about this battle you guys are fighting, which is that there are two forces at play. Obviously, we all would like to believe that when we go to receive care for our bodies, that's the primary goal of whatever entity we're interacting with. But something else has emerged, and I don't quite know how to put my finger on it, and I don't want to just sound like an abject communist by saying it's the profit structures and this greedy corporate overlords, but there's certainly another presence. There's something that has crept into this, because the administrators themselves, they're not evil people, but they're serving a different bottom line than the physician.
Right. I mean, we have to understand that hospitals and healthcare systems are businesses as well, and they are there, even if
powerful businesses.
And if they're there to serve the patient, they're also there to make money. Even if it's what we call not-for-profit, profit hospitals make money, non-profit hospitals make money.
It's a balance of power issue, it sounds like to me. Like, you have these two levers, and they're both important because in some sense, the profit motive drives higher quality care and attracts higher quality individuals to the profession. There are good reasons to incentivize people, practitioners and people who are facilitating and developing the equipment and running the hospital and everything else. But you don't want too much power on that end of the scale,
right?
Because then you're taking it away from the freedom of the practitioner on the other end of the scale to address the issue as they see fit, even if that may come into conflict with the profit motives.
Well, who's going to advocate for you better? The physician, who has taken an oath and has a duty to do what's best for you, or is it going to be a hospital administrator, right? I mean, I think that's a simple question to answer. It should be the physician. Right?
And again, we go back to the model of medicine. So, in the 70s and 80s, nobody was employed by the hospital. It was you were part of the medical staff. And So there was like 2% employment at that time. Now you're 70% employed. And so you're trying to take care of the patient, but who's paying you to take care of the patient? It's the healthcare system.
So there's a conflict of interest, right? If the physicians who are reviewing you, a case comes up, and there's a safety protocol in place, if those physicians work for the hospital and their employment depends on how they judge a situation, that's an inherent conflict of interest, right?
And so this data bank is kind of at the center of everything, because you have in 86 this Healthcare Quality Improvement Act gets passed. As part of the act, there's this data bank that is produced, which allows for people that are hiring physicians at various hospitals to look to see if they have a decent track record.
Can we just call it a blacklist?
Yeah, or a scarlet letter
Scarlet
list.
letter, yeah. Yeah, exactly.
People who work for the data bank don't consider that.
Yeah, I'm sure they don't. And on its face, it's a good thing to have.
Yes. I mean, the goal was to keep people from moving from hospital to hospital or state to state. And every time you change facility, you have to be credentialed. So they check and see, yes, you're really a person. Yes, you really went to medical school. You graduated. You did your residency. If you have your board certification completed. And then they check your criminal background. They check your data bank report. And so they query the data bank at hire when you start at a facility. And then you get re-credentialed every 2 years, and they recheck your data bank every 2 years at minimum. You can have a continuous query. Your hospital can say, we want a continuous query. So anytime something hits the data bank with your name on it, it will go to them. So there's some people query continuously and some people do it on the 2-year schedule, which is very common. So the thing that's interesting is that if you take these two big arenas, medical care and behavior, and you ask the general public, which one is more important? They always say the malpractice. But in reality, everybody gets sued once in a while, so you have a report or two, or you're in a high-risk specialty, so you're a neurosurgeon, so you've got 6, and so forth. But if you get a disruptive physician, a disruptive practitioner report, it's like you'll never get hired again.
And so you're saying that this is from the administrator standpoint. The malpractice stuff gets smoothed out a little bit because anybody who's working inside of medicine knows that malpractice is a little bit weird. And so
they'll say it's not if you're going to get sued, it's when.
Right. And so from the outside, as somebody who's a patient, you're like, well, obviously it's the malpractice that's most important.
Right.
Because, well, if they're malpracticing medicine, they might malpractice on me. But because of the way that the legal system is set up and because of the fact that this is just like a mechanism by which people use to address grievances inside of the system as you're hiring, malpractice is accepted as a risk of doing business.
But the label of disruptive physician or disruptive practitioner has really devolved to the point where the Joint Commission, which is a accrediting body for hospitals, they'll have definition of disruptive physician as, rolling your eyes, tone of voice, your body stance. So it has to do with more how you perceive me than what I'm really intending. And to me, how can you say that tone of voice has the same importance as medical care or malpractice? You're saying, okay, it's a data bank report. There's one of each. Which one is more important? There's scales here.
And from what you've told us about the data bank, it's kind of a weird, it's a weird thing because it's not possible. Like, let's say that you are credentialing a physician and you go into the data bank and you can ask for some kind of information about that one physician. And so you can get information about their malpractice status, if they've had any of these disruptive physician situations, but you don't have a ton of information about what happened. You've mentioned that there's like short blurbs that describe what has happened. And you also don't have the ability to go and look and see, okay, well, is this hospital system just labeling everybody as disruptive physicians? Like, you don't have the ability to freely query the data bank to be able to see if there's patterns, to see if there's some kind of hospital system that's using it improperly. The way that you access it seems unbelievably limited. And so there's just this little piece of contextless
For
information.
contrast, by the way, Nastia, a good example is that traffic highway safety report that they put out every year, which is this kind of meta-analysis. I don't know the name of it off the top of my head. We were talking about it the other day. But you can go and see, how dangerous the roads are this year versus last year, and you can learn about different routes, and it's public information, and the meta-analyses are public, and it seems like it's exactly the opposite with these metrics.
Well, and the other thing is you have to realize that it's not equally applied across the board. So since inception, there's 40% of hospitals and healthcare systems that have never submitted a data bank report.
40% since the 90s have never submitted a data bank report.
So they're just sitting on it?
Yeah, what does that mean? So, like, don't you have to automatically submit a report if there's malpractice inside your system or some physician?
So if you
because you were saying that malpractice stuff gets automatically submitted.
that's automatically submitted by the insurance, but the hospital itself never gave a report.
Right. Well, and there's the cases that occur where a patient is harmed. The hospital, if they, hear of that, they sometimes make these arrangements where they allow the physician to resign. Okay. They don't report him to the data bank because it would cause reputational harm to the hospital if it became public knowledge, for example, that they were having, routine episodes of patient harm. So they kind of quietly agree to let that practitioner go, and they never report them. That's the problem. That's why the law is upside down. And the other huge part of this is this sham peer review. What exactly does a disruptive physician mean? And frequently what has happened is it's good physicians who are calling out safety concerns, right? Who they are actually coming forward and advocating for their patients. They're the ones that get railroaded. They get labeled disruptive and they get data banked. And the due process is not there. And they skirt employment laws, right? I mean, if you came to me and said, "Oh, we think you're disruptive. We don't like the way you're behaving," and they put me under investigation, well, I should have the right to know, well, in what way was I disruptive, and what are the accusations? And the way this current law reads, you don't have those due process rights. It's unbelievable. They enumerate them in the law, like, okay, you're supposed to be notified, right? You have a right to a hearing. There's a time period, 30 days, right? And all of that is negated by this clause in the law. So they enumerate your rights as a physician to due process, and then there's one tiny little sentence inserted into the current law.
It just says, "Just kidding."
Yes, it basically is. It's like, yeah, if you don't do any of that stuff, you won't be considered in violation. So it's this loophole, and it's getting abused. So good physicians are being reported to the data bank under this human resource issue, under this term disruptive. And that's so nebulous, right? Nothing to do with patient care issues, just the decision that, this hospital administration wants to get rid of you, basically.
So it should be pretty easy to fix then.
It takes an act of Congress. Yeah. Because this is a federal law. It's a federal law. And there have been a couple little tweaks, but it's so important to get it right. It's important to get it right for the provider, but it's important to get it right for the patient, because if you can't advocate for your patients, they are at risk. If you're taken out by a sham peer review, and your heart is in the right place, you give good care. And there have been people who've had decades of care, never had a patient complaint, never had a bad outcome, and they're taken down by this process. It hurts medicine overall.
So, Patty, do you think it would be a good idea to talk about, like, an example, like maybe Dr. Ryan, as to how this process? Because right now people hear the term sham peer review and they're like, what's that?
And it's like, how bad could it be?
Right.
Do you know what I mean? So you have some conflict with your hospital superiors and maybe you lose your job. Like, that's okay. Sometimes you lose your job because you get into a fight with your boss. Like, it can't be that bad. And the stories that you've told us are hair-raising.
Yes. So Dr. Ryan, case in point, is a vascular surgeon, and he went to Harvard for medical school, Stanford for surgical residency, the Cleveland Clinic for vascular fellowship. His pedigree is impeccable. And he was hired at Harbor UCLA as a vascular surgeon. And he had a patient, Ms. Higgins, who was 65 years old and had an aortic dissection. That's when there's a tear in the lining of the aorta, and it can actually be life-threatening. So he was taking care of Ms. Higgins, and she was in the hospital for several days. She had no ongoing chest pain. Her vital signs were fine. There was evidence that the body was healing itself. So with a dissection, you could do surgery, you could potentially do stenting, or the body can heal itself. So in his estimation, she could go home and the body would heal itself. So his chairman of the department had a contract with Medtronics and did teaching courses. Now the allegation goes that person then went and looked through records and wound up contacting Ms. Higgins and said, you need to come back to the hospital when you go to the emergency department. Tell them that you have chest pain. Now, she didn't have any chest pain, but this is the hospital calling. And so she did as she was instructed and came to the hospital and was admitted. And 4 days later, had two Medtronics devices that reportedly were worth $15,000 a piece implanted. Now, there was a course that was supposed to occur, and she was allegedly part of this course of how to use these devices.
But these are the devices that she didn't need.
Right? He wanted to try out this device.
So he was looking for subject for the surgery.
And so there wasn't a patient in the hospital who legitimately needed this device implanted. And so he went through the records and just found a patient that was close enough.
So
that's crazy.
So, and this is one thing that it's important to understand. They talk about medicine being a science and an art, and the art part to me of medicine is knowing when less is more. And that's what Dr. Ryan was doing, right? He was letting the body heal itself. He was going to monitor her over time. Because when you do surgery, there's the cost, there's the invasive procedure, there's risk of complications. And she sustained a risk because she had a stroke. And so she had a stroke. She had to relearn how to talk. She couldn't use the telephone because she didn't know how to use a telephone. She had to be in rehab for a month at the hospital and then another 2 months at a rehab center. And her life was changed forever.
And in a just world, the end of this story would be that the physician that implanted the device is the one who gets in trouble and gets peer-reviewed and never works again.
And that's the twist. Who was peer-reviewed? It was Dr. Ryan for protesting.
So yeah, he basically started to make noise about the fact that this wasn't fair, this wasn't right. Like, what did he do?
So he went to administration and talked about the case. And then, of course, there's one version of the story, another version of the story. Oh, yes, we did it on the same day as the course, but it wasn't her that was the course. It was somebody else who was the course. And, so there's different versions of the story, I'm sure, from different parties. But the bottom line is the person who was taking care of the patient, had her best interests at heart, was doing things the way they should be done, was the one who was peer-reviewed. And so he was, suspended, removed from medical staff. So every time you have a case, it illustrates different points. And, for him, he was doing the right thing. He was a patient advocate. And it took 5 years for him to even start having a hearing. And for me, this is a due process issue. You should know when you're under investigation. There should be a time frame for an investigation. And why does the 5 years make a difference? Well, the hospital just delays and delays and delays. And what happens during that time? You're not making money. You're spending money. You're having to pay attorneys. You're running out of hope. You're running out of spirit. They just want you to go away.
Yeah, because so once the peer review concludes, is Ryan then just waiting for a hearing in order to be able to contest it? Is he still working? What happens to him as a person?
He hasn't worked for 10 years.
That's wild.
So in the legislation, the reform legislation that you're both working on, how would you address such an issue from being a problem going forward?
So when you talk about the law, one of the big things is the immunity that we had talked about before. So in the little preamble to the law, it talks about, furtherance of medical care and having immunity for the people participating. So you witness something and you should make a report. But, you've got a mortgage, you have kids and so forth. You don't want to be financially liable for that. You don't want to be sued because you made a proper report. So in the preamble, it says that you're giving immunity. The intent is to give immunity to the person who makes the report, the person who's sitting on the hearing committee and so forth. But when they actually grant immunity, it's to the peer review body. And if you look at the back of the law, the peer review body is the hospital or the healthcare system. It's not to the individual, it's to the healthcare system.
So it's basically the exact opposite of every whistleblower policy that we've heard about, triumphing over some large entity malfeasance.
That is in the federal law itself. But in addition to that, states one by one granted confidentiality and privilege. So confidentiality means that nobody outside this internal process has access to policies and procedures or the medical record or what happened or what the decisions were. So it's a confidential process.
So the physician can't easily pursue their case in the legal system as a result of that.
Right. Because then the third piece is privilege. And privilege is a legal concept where the courts cannot subpoena the records. They cannot require that you testify. So it's a completely closed system. Once you put something into peer review, it's a closed system. So now you've gone through this peer review process, and let's say that it was a sham peer review, and you said, but I didn't do anything. There's no way for you to prove that you didn't do anything. Because if you try to file a lawsuit against the hospital, they have immunity, so they're not financially responsible. They have confidentiality, so you can't see their documents or see anything about the process. And they have privilege, so the court can't require that you testify or require that these documents are produced. So the court gets that lawsuit and says summary judgment on behalf of the healthcare system, meaning I can't hear the case because my hands are tied.
You said something earlier about the fact that most physicians don't even know that this is possible. How is that the case? Right? Because you would think that if there was some lever that your employer could pull to just completely screw you over for trying to do the right thing, that every single physician would be super up in arms about it.
Well, they talk about medical school as drinking from a fire hose. So you're spending so much time just trying to learn the medicine part and becoming a competent doctor. These details are number one, not taught, but number two, people think, oh, well, that will never happen to me.
Or that if you're doing the right thing.
Yeah, again,
Right.
if you're doing the right thing, I will never be harmed.
There must be an element, too, of the churn where physicians are jumping between hospitals. Like, that's a natural piece of people's careers today, I would imagine, is that they would move around more than in the past. And so maybe if one of your colleagues just, disappears one day.
You don't notice?
I mean, you might notice, but you might not think like, you might just be, oh, well, he moved on and went somewhere else, or I don't know. I'm just speculating. I
Well,
have no
most
idea.
people, I think, that experience this sort of thing, it's so shocking. And there's some shame associated with it, right? When someone says you've been peer reviewed in an adverse way, that sounds bad. There's this sort of immediate thought that people have that, oh, you must have done something wrong. Nobody imagines that this sham peer review process exists. And, honestly, the corporate culture, the minute you sign a contract, so imagine you come out of medical school, or out, I should say, when you finish your residency or fellowship, you have $250,000 to $300,000 in debt. A lot of people do. And so you go to take your first job, and the contract you sign to work at the hospital, literally, you sign away your rights in that contract. So it kind of begins there, right? And one of the provisions of our proposed law, one of the remedies for this situation, is that hospitals can't write those clauses in there, right? So it would run afoul of federal law. And that's important because
What is an example of the specific kind of clause? You say you sign your rights away. Is it
You
that
do.
you
Like you won't sue the hospital system, or
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I won't sue the hospital system. You give away your hearing rights. Now, when they say you're giving away your hearing rights, what am I like? What does that mean? So, because you don't know about the process, you don't even know what you're giving up. But it's true in the credentialing process too that they require that you sign a release from liability. Now, really, the release of liability should be, yes, you can contact this person over here and ask about me. You can contact that person and ask about me. You can query the databank and ask about me. But I've seen these release from liabilities and hold harmless clauses that go on for 2 pages. And you're releasing from liability any future hearing processes, any mental health or psych
He
exams.
could be fired without cause.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Termination. So, I mean, it goes on and on.
And people sign them.
And they sign them because, well, I have to be credentialed to work here. So they don't know what they're giving up and really the breadth of what they're giving up.
Yeah.
So it's anything that might happen in the future that could be adverse, you're giving up all rights to.
And so you want to make sure that hospitals cannot write this into contracts so that if something does happen, that the physician has the ability to actually defend themselves or get information. Because if you're not working for 10 years as a physician, like what are you doing? That must be
Unlikely to be hired in the future.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so
You're going broke.
Yeah. Like why
I
can't
mean,
he
people
go to a different
bankrupt from this. It's stress on the family. People get divorced. I mean, it's really terrible.
Why can't Ryan just go to a different hospital system and explain to them what happened and get a job there? Is that just is everything so locked up in these automated systems that there's just no chance that he could just go somewhere else?
The databank is a death blow. You get reported to the databank and no other hospital system is going to hire you.
It's wild because it sounds like it's completely open for these red flags, but you can't actually analyze it beyond that, right? So all the hospital systems have access to the red flags, but any individual or institution can actually penetrate the database as a whole, such to understand what's really happening in the background. That's a weird duality that emerges here.
Right. I mean,
It's
when you're
both
the
everywhere
when
and
you're the
nowhere.
credentialing committee and you get these reports, you could just say we're not going to accept this person onto our medical staff. You can actually sit down with the person and ask them to explain. I've had people who had one databank report and you said, okay, can you sit down with me and discuss this? And that'll be discussed at the credentialing level and then the MEC level and then the board level. And so but by and large they won't even start the process because of that. And the other thing you have to be concerned about is clinical competence. You're a surgeon. You haven't done surgery for 10 years. So a lot of times, if you haven't touched a patient for 2 years, then you need proctoring and you need to do surgery with another surgeon because they need to make sure that you still have the skills and the medical decision making and all of that. So, not doing patient care is a big deal.
And as you've been going through these cases, and presumably they're hard to find because physicians don't want to talk about them. There's not a huge track record of court cases that are successful. And so you're piecing this together through combing through records, finding people that have come forward, finding articles. What's been the most egregious one that you've come across? Because we have, this physician that's trying to stop pure profit seeking actions inside the hospital. Is this the worst of the worst? Or do you think that there are cases that are even more egregious than this that just have made your blood run cold as you read about them?
I would say the Jacob Neufeld case
Yeah.
is particularly haunting.
Do you want to tell us about that?
So Jacob Neufeld, when you read about him, it's really a heart-rending case because when you read about it, everybody loves Jacob Neufeld. And Dr. Neufeld was a pediatrician, but he was triple boarded. I mean, really unusual. He was boarded in pediatrics, pediatric rehabilitation, and adult medicine, adult rehab, and physical medicine. So he had started a journal in pediatric rehabilitation as well. So his career was in full swing, and he was recruited to St. Luke's Hospital in Boise, Idaho, to bring his expertise there and to take care of children. And his specialty was really taking care of, people who are medically fragile, little kids who had head injury or,
spinal cord injury, and
yeah.
they had these baclofen pumps, and they're notoriously exceedingly difficult to manage. It takes somebody with expertise. There's not that many people. I think, what did they say? 100 and some physicians in the country actually had his level of expertise and training. Yeah.
You said baclofen pump? This is like some...
Yeah, it's a continuous infusion of a muscle relaxant because these kids have spasticity, and it's a very high risk medication because if the pump stops working, they literally will seize up. It's almost like this acute withdrawal syndrome that's life threatening.
Right. I mean, life threatening to the point where you're admitted to the ICU. You can have organ failure. You can die. So he's taking care of these delicate children, and one of his associates wound up leaving and taking another job, so that left him by himself. So he was on call 24/7 for months and months. And people who aren't in medicine don't understand what that means. It's not just like you call up and say, "Hey, Joe, I have this thing going on." You have to be within the hospital driving distance of 30 minutes. So for months and months and months, he was on call, and he had gone on a trip, which was pre-planned, and he notified administration and so forth, and they were supposed to get somebody to be like a locum tenens on call, and that didn't happen. So when he went on his trip, there was nobody to cover these patients. And he got a call almost as soon as he got to his destination, and it was a baclofen pump failure. And so he was coaching the physician who was at the hospital in Boise, Idaho, and was helping them get through it. And the kid was admitted to the ICU, but he took the first plane he could back home, landed, drove right to the hospital, and took care of the patient. So he was going to go to administration to talk to them about this issue.
Like, I just can't keep doing this anymore.
So,
well, why wasn't there coverage?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So he goes into the room and there's administrators there, but there's also human resources there. And they had a contract for him because his contract was up for renewal. But he had asked for additional resources, colleagues to work with. He had asked for coverage. And there was no plans in the work for that. 30% pay cut. He knew he can't work under these conditions. And they said he could not leave the room until he either signed the contract or until he agreed to have a psychiatric test, substance abuse and psychiatric testing.
So, like, this is a physician that's basically just completely sacrificed his life for the care of
Yes.
his patients.
Yeah.
And
when you read about him, he just loved kids. He said, when you help a child, you help them for the rest of their life. He played with kids. Now, people who don't do peds don't understand playing with kids is part of the exam, right? You don't say, do this, do that. You play with them and see what they can do. And so he played with his kids. He was very protective of the kids. He gave parents his personal cell phone number, call me anytime, because his goal was to take care of them as an outpatient, and they wouldn't bounce into the hospital. He wanted to have them that stable. He would even do house calls for kids who couldn't make it to his office.
well,
He spent like 40 minutes at least with every patient, because the patients are complex. And he has to deal not just with the child, but teaching the family about the condition, right? So, and then they basically subjected him to shorter evaluations. They told him, oh, you can't spend that amount of time with the patients. So he would be in seeing a patient, there would be a knock on a door with somebody prompting him to hurry up and end that encounter and go see somebody else. So, and it's not really a workable situation, right? You can't advocate for the patient in that situation.
So he's in the room and he has his two options: sign the contract or submit to a psych evaluation. They wouldn't let him talk to an attorney. So, you've got to realize that you're under pressure. And are you going to terminate me? Are you going to harm my license? Will I be able to take care of patients? So the logic was, well, I have nothing to hide, so I'll submit to the psych evaluation. So he was also a person who was evaluated briefly locally, and there's a PHP, just miles down the road. And they sent him from Boise, Idaho to Mississippi to a preferred PHP.
So the PHP is this physician health program, which is inpatient care for physicians. Is that right?
Or other professionals. Yeah.
Oh, so it's
It could be another allied health profession, but most of them, I think, are physicians.
But how prevalent is institutionalization for health professionals and allied professionals? That there's this many of these facilities around the country, and that there's dedicated ones for medical professionals. I've never really thought about the fact that there's like a dedicated place where doctors and those allied with the medical profession
Well,
go for
the
care.
legitimate referrals there are physicians with actual substance abuse problems. That's a legitimate basis for sending someone to one of these facilities, right? But he had no substance abuse problems, right? Clean, like, not even a question. But
How
what
come they don't
happens?
send
You
them
get
to like
trapped in 'em.
normal. So like we'll come back to Neufeld in just a second, but I'm just wondering, like, in terms of a physician that does have a substance abuse problem, why don't they just get sent to a facility that's for the general population? Why is there a specific facility for the medical industry?
I think it's probably what the market will bear, right? Like there's a market for supposedly rehabilitating physicians who have issues, and generally they're payers, right? They're all people that have insurance, or they come from families that have means, and defending your license it's absolutely necessary, right? You have to defend that which you worked so hard for. So I think they sort of sprouted up because it's like a captive audience.
Got it. Okay. So
Yeah, the other thing you have to realize too is that, the substance abuse screening and the psych evaluation just becomes another hoop to jump through. We want you to do this, and you have to go here. Now, this actually is incorrect in that, really, if you're going to require that, it should be with cause. You showed up drunk.
Yeah.
You were found out passed out in your car.
Yeah.
Some reason, maybe you went off your thyroid medicines and, you're not acting your normal self. there has to be a reason that you're being evaluated either medically or psychiatrically. And it also takes away your right as a patient. When you have cancer, I don't say you have to go to this doctor, you have to go to this facility, but that's what they're doing is they're saying you have to go to this specific spot. Why would you send somebody from Boise, Idaho to Mississippi? I mean, it's distance, it's time away from your family, it's, costs, it's everything. So it's very weird. So, in looking at the law and things to make the law correct, you need to separate out, the medical and psychiatric part from, the malpractice and medical care part.
Pardon the interruption, but I have to ask you for a favor. If you are listening to this podcast and you think that what we do is important and you want to support it, then consider coming over to patreon.com/DemystifySci. For 75 cents a week, you can help power this ship and ensure that we continue to be able to do more and more in-person interviews, in-person events, that we are able to hire people to help us with editing, with booking, with putting on conferences, and making DemystifySci something that is more powerful day by day by day. I'll see you there at patreon.com/DemystifySci.
It's weird because in the rest of our lives, when you face the law, it's a really nice country in some sense because you have interesting caveats that other people around the world might not have. Like we have the right to remain silent if we're arrested, right? We don't have to just say anything just because they force us to say it. We're guaranteed, at least in theory, the right to a speedy trial. We have the right to a lawyer. There's these pieces that have been built in that make us, in some sense, feel like we have a chance, right? But this is a weird enclave that's sort of isolated away from the law, it seems like.
It's so full of shame, too, because can you imagine being a physician that is doing everything right and then being told that you have to go in for psychiatric evaluation, being torn away from your family, sent across the country to some facility where you don't know anybody?
The other caveat that's interesting is some medical staff bylaws or hospital bylaws will say that you can ask for a substance abuse or a mental health screening. And if you don't submit to it, they consider you to have voluntarily resigned from the medical staff. So what does that mean? You've voluntarily resigned. You're no longer a medical staff member. You also have no hearing rights. So now that process has just been truncated because you declined to have this done.
And so Neufeld, at the moment where he's in this room with HR, a contract, and the demand that he undergoes psychiatric evaluation, can't say no, because if he says no, then he's terminated immediately?
Well, he probably didn't even know that constituted a voluntary resignation, right? I mean, I wouldn't have known that.
No. And, most people don't read the bylaws to that degree.
Right. Right.
But so he ends up in Mississippi. What happens to him in Mississippi?
He's in Mississippi and he's going to be there for X number of weeks, but his insurance covers more weeks. So now, we think we need to be here longer. And so he's going with the program. Concurrently, he's supposed to be studying for board recertification. So when you have your boards, you get them when you first come out of residency, you take your exams and so forth. But a lot of board certification, every 10 years, you have to recertify. You have to take another exam. So normally he would be studying, but then they said, no, you can't study because if you're studying, you're not paying attention to the program. So he's in a catch-22 because he doesn't want to lose his license because he's not complying with the program, but he doesn't want to not pass his board certification because he's not studying. So he's distressed about that. And, after 10 weeks, he eventually makes it home. And according to what you read, it's like very adversely affected by this process.
Well, they tortured him psychologically while he was there. He felt like he was going crazy. He obviously wasn't crazy when he went in, but the experience of it was so dehumanizing and demoralizing, and they were stripping him of everything that had value to him. He loved taking care of kids. He just wanted to go back to doing that. But when somebody subjects you to that kind of treatment, you kind of you could become depressed, right? You could become psychotic, or you could become unstable, or
Plus, you're locked up with people that are legitimately disturbed, I imagine.
Maybe other people with substance abuse, but these PHP things are not on the level. And the reason they choose sending you to these facilities is because they have relationships with the medical directors of those facilities. And they basically just exhaust your resources. And he didn't even realize, right, that he had protection, like under ADA laws. He didn't realize that. So he really didn't have to use his own resources. But not only did they exhaust all of his insurance, insurance only pays for a certain amount of inpatient psychiatric care. So then they had to pay their own funds to have him at a facility. He didn't even need to be there. So
that is an important thing that physicians should be aware of if this happens to them, right? Is that if
don't go.
Well, don't go. And if you're accused of having psychiatric problems, now you technically have a disability that you can use to shelter you, which is really, really interesting.
But like Patty was saying, he just figured, hey, I got nothing to hide. I'll submit to an evaluation, not having any idea that these dangers were lurking. Yeah.
Right. So he goes back to practice, but in doing so, he is supposed to be on the clock, X number of minutes per patient. He's not supposed to give out his cell phone number to parents because there are boundary issues, and he's not respecting boundaries with families and patients. And he before had given it as a way to take better care of his patients. He wasn't supposed to do his artwork. I mean, they got into every piece of his life.
And he had to be monitored for 5 years. So he had to check in for, periodic psychiatric evaluations. And he had to have a chaperone, right? So essentially he couldn't practice the way that was best for the patient. It was a complete erosion of his rights, and, it would just be maddening.
And what ended up happening to him?
So what happened is he had this, 5-year consent agreement where he's supposed to be ongoing monitored by the PHP and go there every so often for a week and, have evaluations. Well, his wife had gone there to visit him at one point, and then the PHP decided that they wanted her involved in the program.
What does that mean?
That she needed to help with his issues. Well, she didn't want to go. But again, they feel like if you don't comply, anytime you don't comply with a PHP, they'll say, Databank report, lose medical license, all that kind of thing. So she felt like his license and his livelihood was in jeopardy. And she knew that was his, true love, was taking care of kids. So she decided that she would participate. And when she went to participate, he committed suicide.
He hung himself with his dog's leash. Yeah.
That's so dark.
So we lost a person. We lost a physician, a pediatrician, a person who loved kids.
That's unbelievably dark. And is there any recourse for going after the people who did this?
There is none. Yeah.
But if you manage to change the law, then there would be.
Yes. So a couple of aspects that this case illustrates is, the proper evaluation of, physical and mental health. So it really needs to be for cause. There has to be a reason. It shouldn't just be a hoop to jump through. The physician should choose their own facility, practitioner, hospital, just like you would with cancer, as I had mentioned before, or heart or whatever. It's up to you to decide, what's going to happen and who you're going to seek help from. And then with reference to responsibility, this law was designed with all the rights for the hospital, but with rights also should come responsibility. So in our proposal, it's to have a administrative subsection of the National Practitioner Databank. So if you falsely accuse somebody, if you run a sham peer review, if you're found to be liable for, these outcomes, that your name as an administrator should go on the databank. Or if you were a practitioner who falsely accused somebody, your name should go on the databank. So when the databank is queried, and they should have the same thing. They go to a new hospital to be an administrator. They have to have a, background check with the databank as well.
So do you place the fault with the administrators? Like, is it a system thing that just there's some pressure that mysteriously leads people to accidentally commit this guy where he ends up committing suicide? Or do you think that there really is genuinely people, administrators at the helm that are actively trying to destroy the lives of people who oppose them? Like, how much of it is just accident and how much of it is just truly trying to make an example out of somebody?
I mean, I think that there's a huge amount of corporate greed that's going on there. But I also think that there is this personality type that is drawn into these administrator roles. They tend to be very arrogant, narcissistic kind of personalities. And the reason they go into that space is because they are willing to do things to people that most people would not, right? I mean, what they did to him was heinous. He was falsely accused. He was extorted. I mean, they ruined his life. They destroyed a good physician, somebody who was providing excellent care to the patients in that community, right? So it's an erosion of community care. So it has broad, implications.
These sort of administrative positions can attract that sort of personality, and you've all encountered it, right? You're at some kiosk having to get through some wicket, and there's this person standing between you. It could be the DMV, it could be, maybe it's something at your college, or we've all experienced this, and it's not universal, but there is a type of person who really wants to deny you whatever. There's something empowering about denying people, about exercising that. And I don't know if it comes from trauma earlier in their lives or their inability to actually become physicians themselves or whatever it is. But
Well,
right? It's a real force.
Yeah.
It's a real human problem. Like we see this everywhere.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely think that there has to be some nefarious part of that, right? Because otherwise it's unimaginable.
Like no one would participate. Like you could have a structural problem and the human beings, if they weren't into it at least a little bit, would be like, wait, I'm not going to enforce this structural feature that's obviously broken. But that's the problem, is that the entity, the corporate, financial, you said corporate greed, but whatever that entity is that's expressing its needs, everybody goes along with it. People sign up to help it along, right? Because they get whatever they get out of it. And some tiny portion of that at least has to be people empowering themselves, which is scary. I wish it wasn't so.
In my little personal world, I'd like to think the best of everyone.
Me too.
But one thing you can say for sure is if Dr. Neufeld was on call 24/7, months and months and months on end, he's doing the work of 3 people. I mean, if you have only 1 on payroll, but they're doing the work of 3, it's economically beneficial to you as an entity. So there's economic advantage there.
Yeah, that's bizarre. You would think that they would love that.
Yeah. And the other thing is, these become tools by which you get your agenda realized.
Man, it could be so tiny and personal though. Like he could have just like raised his eyebrow to the wrong person or something, right? I mean, it could be something so such a minor, insignificant piece of it.
Which
that-
goes back to why it should be time, date, and patient specific. The offense needs to be quality of care, not raising your eyebrow.
Sometimes somebody's excellence just offends a person in power. I always say if you're on a pedestal, okay, and if you deserve to be on a pedestal, and Dr. Neufeld deserved to be on a pedestal, someone's going to try to knock you down. It's so that's why the case is just so it's so alarming. And they had hired people before he returned from this rehab facility. They had already hired people, replacements. So it's almost as if they knew he wasn't going to accept those terms and conditions, right? I mean, you should see the list of things that they mandated. I mean, and one of them is he's not allowed to paint. Now, how do they govern your personal life? They're telling him he can't go home and paint.
Why?
Does that even make any sense? I mean,
No.
The psych people are telling him this?
they made this list of conditions, yeah, and they were going to hold him to that if he returned and took his job.
That's insane. That's I just
It's
this-
hard to believe this is actually happening. It really is.
Well, it feels like it is this unbelievable confluence of the bureaucratic ability to punish people for not doing what you say, coupled to the necessity to maintain the financial incentives at all costs. And yes, they hired somebody else, but if he's in a psych facility for 10 weeks, they need somebody who's there to be on call. Like, they couldn't have not hired somebody while he was gone. And so it just feels like there's this element of punishment that this law has allowed the administration to exert on its subordinates, which shouldn't be possible. Like, there should be strong enough protections for anybody who's working inside of a hospital system that their administration could never do this to them. It's Kafkaesque. It's just it's unbelievable.
Well, so one of the features that we added to our proposed legislation is a whistleblower protection. So I can give you an example, and this is recent. Like, this literally happened last week. There's a lawsuit that has been filed against UVA. UVA is in Charlottesville, Virginia, and it was a mecca of good care, right? And shortly before the COVID pandemic, they recruited this new CEO, and his name was Dr. Craig Kent. Okay, so he actually had a vote of no confidence taken about him at Ohio State, where he came from. So he shows up to the UVA facility, and he just starts raining terror down on the system.
And like, nobody bothers to call the healthcare system that he came from to be like, why'd you guys get rid of him?
Well, you should have, right? I mean, that would be due diligence. And if there were a parallel databank for administrators, you could look them up and say, oh, geez, this guy sounded like he wasn't the right fit. But then this guy comes in, and he systematically starts hiring cronies, other people in administrative positions, and he openly declared that it was going to become about maximizing profits, and that anybody that got in his way was going to be taken out. And so he brings in all these other administrators, and UVA is a big system, right? There's the medical school, there's the healthcare system, right? And so all of these people systematically replace chairmen of the departments in 16 out of 31 departments, right? They just go in and just replace the people who had been there, veteran providers, physicians, and replace them with their sort of yes people. And they even hire surgeons that are incompetent. Some of these surgeons they hired, one of them had been found guilty of fraud, of healthcare fraud, to the tune of $15 million they paid a fine to HHS. Another one had restrictions on her practice that she was actually not supposed to operate unsupervised.
Are there like dark medicine conferences where all these people are getting together and talking about how to scam the system? Like, how is he finding all these people to hire?
Well, he knew them. So he kind of knew what their personality was like, and he knew that they would participate. They're calling it the Kent Enterprise. Well, it's almost mafia-like. So they ended up hiring 550 people in the healthcare system, and then they systematically harassed the existing physicians who were calling this out. And ironically, there was an emergency physician. Emergency physicians are good at sniffing out, people's their character. And he'd sent a letter to the president of the university. He said, "You know what? This administrator complex that you have here, they're running afoul of patient safety protocols. They're creating this bad culture at this institution. They're retaliating, and they would take these physicians, these veteran physicians, been there for 30 years, right? Part of why the institution had a good reputation. And they would do these 5-on-1. They would take these administrators or other surgeons and they would just attack them 5-on-1 in meetings. And they got stripped of, their department chairmanships or grant money or titles. They would write up false reports, patient safety reports about them. And these surgeons were horrible. They were harassing residents, okay? The residents, they were scared, right? So the residents all got together and they actually filed a complaint, like with graduate medical committee, and somebody, forwarded this report. These residents are saying, "Hey, we don't think these new doctors that are supposed to be teaching us, we don't think they're competent, and they're really kind of, they're malignant." And the president of the hospital just ignored it, like, "Oh, these are just." Residents that are griping because it's hard work or whatever, ignored it. And then finally, 128 physicians at UVA signed a no confidence letter and had it sent to the president. And that guy still wouldn't step down, right? He stepped down. It was almost a year later. But in the meantime, some of these surgeons, okay, they had caused the death of 2 patients after this was made known to the president of the university. And one of these surgeons had committed an error during surgery, causing the patient an intraoperative stroke. And they refused to address the stroke because there's protocols in hospitals if someone has a stroke. Even if you've been in there for a surgery, there's a protocol, right? You call a stroke team. And she refused to even call a neurologist to evaluate the patient. The residents were urging her, the nurses were urging her. It was just like such an obvious thing to do. Like, let's deal with this person's stroke. So this physician allegedly sat this resident down and forced the resident to write an order in the chart that was going to kill the patient because dead people don't talk, right? So these 2 deaths happened. And then finally, this enterprise was, it was going to be dismantled, and these administrators, went and left and then practiced somewhere else. But
Wait. They just left and they went somewhere else?
Oh yeah, the administrators took jobs elsewhere. Nothing happened to them yet. Now they're in court. But
That's so unbelievable.
yeah, but this is the kind of corporate greed, right? That is going on. And all of these veteran physicians have been stripped of their titles, and there's 4 physicians in the lawsuit, and then there's the estate of the 2 deceased patients. That happened after the vote of no confidence, or that happened as a collective action on the part of the employees at UVA.
Well, I'm a little bit nervous about the word, it's not a word, but the phrase corporate greed, because we're assigning this emotional incentive base to a corporation, which isn't a person. Like, I don't think corporations are necessarily greedy. It's just that they're only designed to make money. They're just doing their job, right? It's like you can't get mad at a bicycle for going down the streets. Even some humans are still driving the bicycle at the end of the day, or driving a car into like a crowd of people or something, right? It's not like the car's fault necessarily. Like the corporation itself can only aim for higher and higher returns and to please its shareholders year after year, right?
But it's the bad actors in those corporations, right? Those are the problem.
Yeah, I think that the greed or the willingness to hurt people to get ahead is is at the core of this example in some sense. I mean, of course, you need to limit the power of the corporation to do its job, which is to make a lot of money, because if that comes into conflict with providing the actual genuine service to the patients on the other end, that's scary too. But there's also this human element, and I've been trying to sort that out this entire conversation, because there's, there are structural issues that can be repaired by the bill, but you also just are contending with this horrifying reality that, like, some people are willing to just step on other people, and that's really, really scary too.
Well, there's no so there's actually that case actually has seven court filings. One of them is actually RICO, racketeering and conspiracy to commit racketeering. Okay, it's also whistleblower protection. And so that section has been added to our proposed legislation for that very reason, because right now there is no protection for a physician who calls this out. And so this is I think it's going to end up being a big case to highlight all of these issues. You should be able to come out if you notice that there are physicians who are unqualified that are operating on. There's also fraud, Medicare fraud, double billing, and all these other, things. They violated their hiring policies, right? They're a state institution. They're supposed to have a set of criteria that they go through before they hire someone, not just appoint people, right? So yeah, I think that people need whistleblower protection. I think it's a huge part of that.
It also feels like a really weird acceleration of a phenomenon that's been happening inside the medical system for a long time. Because we talk about the way that hospital systems have changed and how 1986 is this momentous benchmark for the way that these things are changing, because we have all of these laws that are starting, and it seems like the acknowledgement that corporations do nothing but maximize profits has filtered into our awareness more and more and more and more, where maybe 40 years ago, if the director of a hospital system said that the thing that he would be too embarrassed to say that the thing that we're after is maximizing profits. It would seem gauche and kind of horrifying and weird to say such a thing. And now we live at a time where, well, everything's private equity, everything is oriented towards maximizing shareholder value. This is just the water in which we swim, that it's not even particularly surprising that he would say so. Like, there's this hilarious Goldman Sachs presentation about medical care, and it says, "Is curing patients a sustainable business model?" And the answer is obviously no, because it's much more profitable to keep somebody in the system for an extended period of time. And it feels like there's a lot of weird stuff that's happening right now, which seems to suggest that the natural consequence of a medical system that treats patients as piggy banks, that provide as much value as humanly possible, that just gets squeezed to the last penny that they can give up, is creating a whole new crop of strange incentives. Because
And maybe breeding bad actors or empowering and attract, right? Because, what is it, like only 5% of the population tends to be psychopathic or something like that. Like, it's a really small percentage of the population that are like really genuinely evil people. But I imagine you could breed evil people in some sense. Like, you could incentivize them properly to do bad if you had a structure like this that would attract them to that, and you might just end up making your general citizenry worse as a consequence of it.
Well, if we just start to assume that somebody who shows up to the hospital, it's like, if somebody who shows up to the hospital can no longer expect super good medical treatment because the physicians that are preoccupied with good medical treatment have gradually been pushed out by these sorts of approaches that you guys are fighting against, where the administration has a way of just silencing anybody who pushes back against these practices, then what we end up at is that when you walk through the doors of a hospital, all of the sudden what you're doing is it almost feels like there's a price tag on you. And the logical extreme of that is that the most expensive, the most profit that a hospital system can generate off of you is literally the parts of your body, right? Like, it's organ donation, it's tissue donation, it's the fact that if somebody walks through the door and there's nobody, and this is of course like a sci-fi extreme, right? And so in a totally dystopian universe, the hospital is not a place where you get cured, it's a place where you go to get harvested if you're dumb enough to walk through the door. And the only thing that stands in the way of that is the physicians that have some ability to protest against the maximizing of profits and the degradation of patient care. And so it seems like this Databank and this Healthcare Quality Improvement Act is eroding the ability of physicians to protest against this profit maximization, and that if you guys don't succeed in this, that there's nothing really that stops us from heading farther and farther and farther into that really dystopian future where the hospital is not out to help you. The hospital is out to harvest you. And that's pretty crazy.
Yeah, you say, okay, how bad can this situation get? You know, what if we don't stop this? And then you think about it in terms of organ harvesting. I mean, that's sort of a fear that people have, right? People have fear of being anesthetized. What's going to happen to me when I'm under surgery, right? And imagine that being extrapolated to the worst case scenario. Oh my God, they want my organs. There's big money in it. It's big business. And I think it's become an issue now because we've discovered that even in the United States healthcare system, that's happening, that people's organs are being harvested for the purposes of supposedly giving them to somebody who needs the organ, right? And but sometimes they're harvested and they're thrown away, and it's just it's a money making scheme. But in the worst case scenario, they've made this definition of brain death, right? And now there's some discussion about what is that actual definition, and are we going to devalue someone's life who, you know, maybe they were in a terrible accident and maybe they're going to die, but do we not allow them to sort of live out their life? Is there no value to the end of their life and the dignity in dying and all of that? Or are we just approaching this like, well, you're going to die soon anyway, let's get those organs going on, right?
We were talking about this last night and I was completely blown away. I know this is utterly naive and embarrassing, but I had no idea this was like a for-profit industry, harvesting parts of people's bodies and trading them to different hospitals and all of that.
They're not supposed to be making money off of it, but they get paid for the procedure, right?
Can you explain that?
So 1986.
Uh-oh.
You know, this seems like it was a bad year, right?
Orwell was off by 2 years.
Yeah. So that's when they established the system on how they were going to control like organ procurement, and they set up the rule structure behind that, and it's under HHS, and it's supposedly, you know, it's all supposed to be for the good of the patients, but like Patty has an example from the organ procurement of how these hospital systems were treating patient populations differently.
So there's a man named Patrick Chase who had worked in that arena for years, and he obtained a position as director of renal transplant services at a hospital in Dallas. And there were two hospitals. He worked for Parkland Hospital, and there was a sister facility, the University of Texas Southwestern. So Parkland serviced people who were economically disadvantaged, and the other hospital had more affluent clientele. So he had observed that organs that were offered to Parkland patients, the organs were deemed as being unacceptable. But those same organs would then go to UT Southwestern and be utilized. So in his mind, you know, if it's a bad organ, it's a bad organ. You shouldn't be using it. But it was really a way of triaging away from the one hospital to the other hospital. And he protested that.
You have a poor hospital that has people that need organ transplants, and they're on national transplant lists that are maintained by this law that was enacted in 1986. And then the organs arrive at the hospital. Somebody, some administrator or someone who is in charge of this looks at the organ and says, I don't think we're gonna, no, this is not high enough quality to implant. But then that goes to the richer hospital, and then it gets actually put into a patient there. And so
they bypassed, yeah.
The caveat is that it's the same transplant surgeons at both facilities.
No.
So it's the transplant surgeon who deems this, and then the organ goes to the other hospital, and they go down the road and transplant into the other patient.
And so are they
people
getting paid more at the other hospital? So is the transplant surgeon getting paid more at the other hospital? And so this is a thing where they're trying to enrich themselves? Or what do you think the mechanism is, if you had to speculate?
So I don't know the actual answer to that, but if you have an affluent hospital, you want the money to go there. And you still have the patients in Parkland Hospital who are on the list. And to be on the list, you still have to have blood work done and so forth. That blood work and maintenance is also done at UT Southwestern. So they're a Parkland Hospital, but if your blood work is drawn here, it's sent to UT Southwestern. The one really unusual caveat is that if you have a living donor, your brother, your cousin, whoever who's going to donate you a kidney, this one I found really unusual. And you're a Parkland patient, they would require that the harvesting be done at UT Southwestern. Then they would take the organ and the surgeon and move down the road and do the surgery at Parkland to put the organ in. So now you've separated the donor and the recipient, whereas really Parkland had the facility to do the harvesting, and you walk across the hallway with the organ and then you put it in. So they put this step in again, presumably so that Southwestern would get the dollars that it took for the harvesting process.
And who's paying out the dollars for the harvesting process? This is the insurance companies? This is like the federal government's paying
The
out?
vast majority of transplant dollars, once you have renal failure, whether you're on dialysis, you're qualifying for transplant, you get a transplant, you have post-transplant complications, it's Medicare and Medicaid. It's Medicare. So it's CMS that's paying.
So the federal government is paying out for this. And so these hospitals basically have a system of making sure that the already affluent hospital is getting the support from the federal government, and they're removing it from the hospital that serves the lower class population or the poor population.
And this was a well-known process within the system, according to Mr. Chase.
And there's a current lawsuit about this. What were you going to say, Shay?
I was just going to say, it seems like there's more instances of this becoming more and more systematized in general, right? You mentioned there being ways in which hospital staff are getting trained on how to exploit some of these loopholes. So, like, it was just course of action. It was just par for the course to do this kind of thing.
It's a complicated network. So there's these OPOs, organ procurement organizations, that are regional. Then there's these governing bodies, who are supposed to do oversight. And it turns out that they found ways to avoid oversight. And they found ways to basically fraudulently bill Medicare because they knew Medicare was paying for it. So when you're a transplant candidate, there's a whole battery of tests that have to get done before you get the transplant. And there's revenue associated with all of that, right? They have to do echocardiogram. They have to do dental evaluations, check renal function. And they just systematically found ways to either double bill or fraudulently bill Medicare. And they would also, correct me if I'm wrong, they were taking patients that they knew could not survive an organ transplant, and they were harvesting organs from people and transplanting them, and those patients would die because they weren't good candidates. And they knew that, but they could bill for transplanting the organ.
So Mr. Chase tried to address this with administration. He pointed out the the things that he saw, and even suggested, well, we could have our own set of transplant surgeons and service our own patients. We have the resources, we have the expertise. And that was not permitted.
And he filed a lawsuit? This is where you're getting this information from?
Yes. So he filed a QTEM lawsuit, which is a really unusual lawsuit because you as an individual are filing a lawsuit on behalf of the United States government.
And basically, if the government is being defrauded out of money, you're assigned the term the relator. So the person who is filing the case is called the relator. So they're relating that information about the malfeasance, and there's some compensation should they prevail in court that comes to the relator. So the whistleblower actually gets compensated, and I think it's like 25 or 30% or whatever of the award that's made out. But it kind of, I guess, is a way to encourage people to call out when the government is being defrauded. So it's an interesting case. And then the government they have the option to actually join in the lawsuit. So we don't know that yet because this is new.
Yeah.
But it's not just in Dallas.
27 cases of states that have joined the law. So 27 states, Washington, D.C., and Puerto Rico have joined this QTEM lawsuit.
And the lawsuit is not just against this Texas hospital system. It includes other hospital systems as well.
Right. So there was Parkland and the University of Texas at Southwestern. And interestingly, you can do a QTEM lawsuit against an individual or a corporation. You can't do it against a state. So UT Southwestern was thrown out of that lawsuit. But Chase then, was employed at Parkland Hospital, and they call it constructively discharged. What that means is that they weren't happy with him. And his allegations. So when you're constructively discharged, it means that you make that person's life so miserable that a reasonable person could never exist in that environment and would quit. So it's a way of firing somebody without technically firing them. So he then went to the he went to Loyola. Yeah. Loyola, which is a private hospital. And he was director of solid transplant organs there. And he was equally dismayed with their transplant program. And so some of these things were that Loyola said, well, we'll take the sickest of the sick. And they would transplant organs into people who had no chance of surviving. And so in Mr. Chase's estimation, an allegation, that organ should have been given to somebody who could survive the transplant and benefit from the transplant. So you harm not just the one patient who got the organ who died anyway, you harm the second patient who should have received an organ and could have lived for years or thrived with an organ.
What's the financial incentive for putting an organ into somebody who's not going to survive versus finding somebody that you can give the organ to? Is it that you don't have a patient inside your hospital system that can take the organ that will survive?
They just don't have somebody sitting around ready for the exact match or whatever, and they just want to. They don't want it to go to waste, and they can just drain some blood.
That's what I'm trying to say. Yeah, is that it has to be a consequence of the fact that they look at their patient population, and they're like, "Well, we have this organ, and we can make money off of implanting this organ, but we don't have a patient."
Don't sit on You can't put them in the fridge overnight or something, right?
Actually, they did discover organs that were placed on shelves in freezer units in part of the investigation of this whole thing, which the organs aren't going to survive.
They just were not using them? They had harvested them, but they weren't using them?
How does your how would your reform bill address this?
So this would be through a whistleblower protection. Now, this particular person was an administrator, but he would be protected also under the whistleblower protection in the law. And this was somebody we reached out to is Tom Devine, and he has spent his whole career doing whistleblower laws. He's testified in front of Congress 50 times. So we spoke with him on the phone, emailed, we went to Washington, D.C. and met him, and he actually wrote the whistleblower protection part in our bill.
I guess the surprising thing to me is that this seems to not be a new problem. The weirdness of peer review being used vindictively is that it seems to have started almost as soon as the law was passed. As soon as the Databank was instituted, it was already being used in order to silence physicians.
But I think it's increased and they've gotten more bold.
And so what was some of the early cases that you saw that had to do with this?
Sure. So Dr. Kirby was a cardiothoracic surgeon who did transplants. And he had a great pedigree as far as his training goes. He was at the Cleveland Clinic for 10 years, and he was recruited by university hospitals at Case Western, which is in northern Ohio. And he was to direct their program. So he said, well, if I go there, I'm not going to run a second-rate program. And they agreed. Yeah, bring it on. So he went there, and the first thing he did was start doing what surgeons do, and he's assessing the program, post-op complications, time under anesthesia, blood usage, post-op infections, death rates, mortality, morbidity, and that's just bread and butter surgeon stuff. And he said, you know what? We can do better. And so he came up with a plan. He was going to recruit a couple new people, had interviewed people and so forth. And all of a sudden, he starts getting questions from administration and started being labeled as a disruptive physician. And he was confused because, he's doing the job he was hired to do. And they marched down this pathway, and he went into peer review. He spent hundreds of thousands of dollars and only had gotten to the hearing process. He was in the, thrust of financial ruin and foreclosure on his house, and he wound up being dismissed. This is a man who was doing the job he was supposed to do, was an excellent surgeon, never had patient complaints, never had bad outcomes. It was really all a sham peer review.
And what was the outcome for him?
The outcome for him is that he wound up going to Canada and practicing medicine. And he's deceased now. He died at the age of 69.
Oh, wow. That's really young.
So the cost of courage, how the tables turned on doctors, was this series of articles and outlined various examples of whistleblowers and sham peer review. And when I first read it, I'm all, oh, these are such great examples. But gosh, this article is from 2003. And as physicians, you're looking for articles for the last 5 years or the last 10 years. And then as I kept thinking about it, I'm all, well, that's just the point. It's from 2003. Well, these cases in this article series were from the late 90s into 2000. Because it takes time for these cases to be processed. So if the Databank started in 1990, by the late 90s, mid to late 90s, you're already having cases of sham peer review. And so that is the whole point. This article and series of articles was written in 2003 by Stephen Tweed, who's an investigative journalist, Pulitzer Prize winner. And that's 22 years ago. So it was identified decades ago, and we're still dealing with it, and it's time to fix it.
So, what can people listening to this do? How can people participate? What can I do?
Well, one is, all of us interface with the healthcare system. Some of us have family, friends. You need to speak to them about these topics because that's one of the things we want is education of the public, education of people who are healthcare providers. So that's number one.
Like physicians don't even know about it for the most part, that these kind of things are happening.
Right.
And they should be well aware ahead of time.
Right. And we actually have that in our law, that an education piece should be required. Now, there's precedent for that because HIPAA, which is the information privacy piece, is something that every patient knows about. Every patient knows about HIPAA. You go to your doctor. Would you like to sign this form? No, I've signed it before. I don't need to see it. Whatever, I understand it. So people understand HIPAA. And physicians are required to do modules on HIPAA training and so forth. And so I think that this is important enough that that precedent should be used and education required on HCQIA.
So we want physicians to know about it. And that can happen if there's a physician out there listening who has been a victim of sham peer review or has seen these kind of processes happening, please contact us.
Should people call their senators, call their Congress people, tell them that this matters to them, that that there's some people trying to get a bill reform
Right.
done?
And that is so critical because, they want to make their constituents happy. And if the constituents bring up a topic, they are more likely to address it.
And specifically, physicians who serve on the HELP committee are the best points of contact about that issue. There's physicians on that committee, so they're going to be familiar with the law, and it probably will be easier to approach them about it. And please check out our Substack.
Yeah, what's on the
Because-
Substack?
Well, we have some examples of the sham peer review or the failure of this law, failure of HCQIA, to actually result in patient safety. And we have an outline of what the problems are with the law, bullet points, and then our proposals to fix the law. And then we actually have a copy of our proposed legislation. That's longer, but it has links to it where if you want to really go and sort of do a deep dive on this, you can click on the links and it will provide the sources.
One thing that's really cool about this is it seems to cross the political aisles, right? It seems like this would matter to everyone. So you could call your congressperson, no matter what your political persuasions are, and contribute to fixing.
Absolutely.
I mean, the health is something that matters to everybody, right?
And, letters and emails count, but I did speak to one of our congresspeople and he said that phone calls matter. He said he will get tons of emails, like in the hundreds, but maybe 1, 2, or 3 phone calls a day. So people should call their representative. That seems to have impact.
Squeaky wheel gets the grease.
Yeah, and I think that you've said this before, that at some point everybody's going to be a patient. All of us at some point in our lives are going to end up in a position where we are dependent upon a system that maybe we've never used before, and so we haven't really thought that much about. And I think that what's so important and so valuable about what you're doing is that you're saying, look, there are problems with this. We, as people from the inside, have experienced those problems. We know how it falls apart. We know the risks of ignoring it. We know the problems with the way that this law was written that have allowed it to be misused, and we can do something about it. We've drafted legislation that will allow us to change the worst parts of this law. It will allow us to protect patients, to protect physicians, to protect the sanctity of a system that people turn to in their moment of greatest need. It is when they are most vulnerable that they end up subject to this. And the idea that we would just let it get eroded by the same sort of inverted incentives that have eroded everything else just seems unbelievably tragic and like something that we can't let happen.
And at the same time, it has the hope, if it succeeds, it can inspire hope for all of these other institutions which have been inverted, right? Maybe we'll learn a lesson in the academic world about how to deal with toxic administration from the successes that they have when they eventually get this bill reformed.
Absolutely. So what's the next step for you guys? You've drafted the bill, you have the Substack, you're starting to do interviews. What's the next phase?
Right. Education is
Education.
where we're at right now.
Yeah, we're trying to educate.
Whether it's the general public, the providers, the senators, the congressmen.
Yeah, we're trying to get the message out there. And I think we need to present it to the legislators as a broad healthcare concern. not just an administrative thing, and hopefully they'll take interest in that, and maybe it'll be part of a broader agenda to improve healthcare. But it's sort of this silent killer, right? That no one knows about, that even physicians don't know about it. So a part of our big focus now is making people aware, education.
Absolutely. I love that.
Yeah, well, I hope we've given you guys some good practice as you launch out on your podcasting tour.
Maybe this is, good timing with Halloween coming up. Scary stuff. Here's some scary stuff you need to know about.
Scared straight, yeah.
Yeah, I love that.
In some ways, it's an advantage to be naive because
Yeah.
you just keep moving forward. And if you really knew what opposition you'd have, you would have never started in the first place.
You guys have the human side on your side, and that's really, really important. I really, really, really believe that. I mean, there's literally been conflict after conflict over the years, from like Afghanistan to Vietnam, these occupations where there's a huge, big, wealthy entity that is attacking people on their own ground, and those people just aren't going to give up, and they know, and that's like the physicians on the ground for me. It's like they're not going to give up. They see this day in, day out. They're going to win. Like you guys are going to win.
We have a winning cause.
We'll take it.
We'll take it.
Everybody's going to be a patient one day. And so I just, knowing full well that that's waiting for me, I wish you the greatest success. And I have full confidence that you'll be able to make it. And so thank you for taking the time, for flying all the way out here to talk to us.
Thank you so much for your interest in this topic.
Yes, definitely. And we appreciate a vote of confidence. That's great.
Yeah.
All right, bye, everybody.